Since you cannot give this family a proper heir, this marriage is officially over. The thick blue folder slid across the polished mahogany dining table, stopping mere inches from my plate. My father-in-law, Reginald Sterling, stared at me with cold, calculating eyes. I looked at my husband, Marcus. He did not say a single word. He just kept his gaze firmly glued to his glass of Cabernet, entirely too cowardly to even look at the woman he had been married to for 4 years. I did not cry. I did not scream. I simply reached into my purse, pulled out my favorite pen, and signed every single page. Then my best friend Tara stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, and tossed a heavy brown envelope right into the center of the table. What happened next would completely dismantle an entire Atlanta real estate empire. My name is Nia. I am 32 years old, and my husband's family thought I was just a lowly desk accountant they could easily discard. They had no idea I was about to strip them of absolutely everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who severely underestimated your worth. Just 30 minutes before that spectacular implosion, we were sitting down for the annual Sterling family Thanksgiving dinner. To the outside world, the Sterlings were Atlanta royalty. Reginald was a commercial real estate mogul, and his wife Vivian was a high society staple, a proud Spelman College alumna, and a prominent figure in her sorority. Their mansion in the affluent Tuxedo Park neighborhood was designed to intimidate from the towering white columns at the entrance to the massive crystal chandeliers, casting a cold, brilliant light over the formal dining room. For 4 long years, I had endured their relentless attempts to make me feel like I did not belong. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city. I went to a state university on a full academic scholarship, working 2 jobs to graduate entirely debt-free. To Vivian and Reginald, my lack of generational wealth and Ivy League credentials was a permanent stain on their perfect family portrait. The dinner began exactly as these holiday gatherings always did, with passive-aggressive attacks, disguised as polite upper-class conversation. I had spent hours the night before baking a traditional sweet potato pie and making my grandmother's famous baked candied yams. I placed the warm dishes on the buffet table, hoping for at least a tiny bit of civility. My sister-in-law, Chloe, was the first to strike. Chloe was married to Jamal, my husband's older brother. She was a wealthy white woman from New England who loved to play the role of the perfect enlightened ally while constantly dropping the most toxic microaggressions you could imagine. "Oh, Nia, these candied yams look so very rustic," Chloe said, peering at my dish with a tight, condescending smile. "Did you find this recipe on some budget cooking blog? Next time, just let me know. I can have our private chef whip up something a bit more refined and organic for the holidays." It is so cute how you always try to contribute with these little home-style soul food recipes, though. Before I could even formulate a response, Vivian chimed in from the head of the table. Her posture was rigidly perfect, her expensive pearls catching the light as she looked down her nose at me. "Chloe is just trying to help Nia. You always try so hard to fit in, bless your heart. It reminds me of when you tried to join the junior committee of my charity foundation right out of that little public college of yours. You have to understand that in our circle, pedigree matters. When I was at Spelman, we were taught that a woman's presentation is everything. We expect a certain level of excellence that simply cannot be learned on the south side of town." I took a slow sip of my ice water, forcing my facial expression to remain perfectly neutral. My husband Marcus sat right next to me, slicing his turkey with meticulous precision, acting as if he was completely deaf to the insults being hurled at his own wife. He was the vice president of his father's company, but in reality, he was nothing more than a highly paid puppet who nodded along to whatever Reginald dictated. He had never once stood up for me. Not when Vivian mocked my clothes, not when Chloe used her weaponized tears to play the victim, and certainly not tonight. My best friend Tara, who had joined us for dinner because her own family was out of the country, shifted uncomfortably in the seat beside me. Tara was a brilliant corporate mergers and acquisitions attorney, sharp, wealthy in her own right, and fiercely protective. I felt her foot tap mine under the table, a silent check to see if I was going to lose my temper. I just offered her a tiny, reassuring smile. I did not need to explode. I had been preparing for this specific holiday dinner for the past 3 years. I knew exactly what was coming, and I knew exactly how it was going to end. The conversation around the table quickly shifted to Jamal and Chloe, the undeniable family favorites. They had 2 young sons, securing their highly valued position as the producers of the Sterling heirs. Reginald beamed at them loudly, praising Jamal for closing a minor real estate deal earlier that month, while completely ignoring the fact that Marcus had been drowning at work. The entire family dynamic was built on this toxic hierarchy, a sick game of favorites, where love was measured in financial output and the continuation of their bloodline. As the dessert plates were being cleared away by the catering staff, Reginald tapped his heavy silver spoon against his crystal wine glass. The sharp ringing sound brought the room to an immediate halt. He stood up, adjusting his custom-tailored suit jacket, and looked down the long length of the table directly at me. His eyes were completely devoid of any familial warmth. "We have a lot to be thankful for this year." Reginald began, his voice dropping into the deep, authoritative tone he used to intimidate people in boardrooms. "We have our health, we have our wealth, and we have Jamal and Chloe ensuring the Sterling legacy will continue for generations to come. But maintaining an empire requires making difficult decisions to cut out the dead weight." He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out that thick blue folder. He tossed it onto the table and it slid smoothly across the polished wood, stopping right next to my plate. The room went dead silent. Even Chloe stopped her fake, polite smiling. "Since you cannot give this family a proper heir?" Reginald announced loudly enough for the staff in the kitchen to hear every single word. "This marriage is officially over. Marcus deserves a real woman who can give him children and uphold our high standards. We are done waiting for a miracle that is never going to happen. Sign the papers, Nia." The sheer calculated cruelty of doing this at a Thanksgiving dinner with guests present was staggering. I turned my head slowly to look at Marcus. He was sweating profusely, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed firmly on his plate. He refused to look at me. He had known about this. He had let his father stage this public execution of our marriage because he was too spineless to ask for a divorce himself. Vivian crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair with a look of absolute triumph. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be, Nia. You never truly belonged with us anyway. We will give you a small severance package just to help you transition back to whatever working-class neighborhood you came from. Just sign the papers and leave quietly." Tara tensed beside me, her lawyer instincts fully kicking in, ready to tear them apart verbally. I put a gentle hand on her arm, stopping her. I picked up the blue folder and opened it. It was a standard divorce petition, citing irreconcilable differences, heavily weighted to ensure I walked away with absolutely zero assets. They really thought I was just going to cry, beg for my husband's love, and walk out into the cold night empty-handed. They thought I was just a simple accountant counting their pennies. They did not know I was a senior forensic data auditor. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I simply picked up my pen and signed my name on the dotted line with steady, deliberate strokes. The silence in the room was absolute and heavy. They had expected a massive breakdown. They had wanted a dramatic, hysterical reaction that would confirm their false narrative of me being unstable and unworthy of their name. My cold, calm compliance clearly unsettled every single person at that table. I closed the folder, smoothed my hands over the cover, and slid it back across the table toward Reginald. "Done," I said, my voice incredibly smooth and perfectly even. "I am more than happy to sign these. In fact, this is the absolute best Thanksgiving gift I could have possibly asked for." Reginald narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious of my lack of emotion, but his arrogance quickly took over again. "Good. Now go upstairs, pack your cheap clothes, and get out of my son's house by midnight. I want you gone before the catering staff finishes washing the dishes." I picked up my linen napkin, elegantly dabbing the corners of my mouth before placing it gently beside my plate. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my dress. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the mahogany surface, and looked directly into my father-in-law's smug, arrogant eyes. "Pack my bags and get out of Marcus's house," I repeated, letting the words hang in the silent air for a brief, agonizing second. I tilted my head and offered him a chilling smile. Get out of where? Reginald, do you even know who the actual legal owner of that house in Buckhead is? Reginald's thick eyebrows knitted together, forming a deep ridge over his nose. He looked from me to Marcus, then back to me, treating my question like a poorly constructed joke. He let out a harsh bark of laughter that echoed off the high ceiling of the dining room. What kind of ridiculous question is that? He scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. Marcus owns that house. I personally wired the $200,000 down payment to his account when you two got married. It is a sterling property bought with sterling money. I smiled, shaking my head slowly. I folded my hands neatly on my lap, sitting up perfectly straight. You did wire him that money, Reginald. You are absolutely right about that. But I think you are forgetting what happened exactly 8 months after our wedding. The color began to drain from Marcus's face. He suddenly dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against his fine china plate, the sound piercing the tense silence of the room. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, his voice trembling, but I cut him off before he could utter a single syllable. Do you remember that rainy Tuesday night in November 4 years ago? I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the grand table. The night Marcus decided to leave a Buckhead lounge after downing 6 glasses of bourbon. The night he ran a red light and totaled his brand new Porsche by slamming it into a minivan driven by a local business owner. Vivian gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. We do not speak of that incident, she hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward the kitchen doors to ensure the catering staff could not hear. It was handled privately. It was handled because you were terrified of a civil lawsuit. I corrected her, maintaining my calm, even tone. The driver of that minivan was threatening to sue Marcus for everything he owned. You and Reginald panicked. You pulled me into this very dining room and told me to use my accounting skills to protect Marcus's assets. You told me to hide the house so the courts could not touch it. You begged me to fix your son's mess. Reginald slammed his hand flat on the table, making the wine glasses shake. We told you to put it in a trust, he bellowed. And I told you a standard trust could easily be pierced by a competent personal injury lawyer in the state of Georgia, I replied, staring him down without blinking. So I did what I do best. I restructured his assets. But in order to completely remove Marcus's name from the public record and shield the property from any impending litigation, the house had to be sold. It had to be purchased outright by an anonymous limited liability company. The room grew so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Jamal, who had been arrogantly sipping his drink just moments before, slowly set his glass down. He looked at his brother with a dawning realization. Marcus did not have the liquid cash to buy the house outright from the bank. I continued, my eyes locked on Reginald. And you refused to liquidate your own commercial assets to help him because you were too busy trying to hide your own financial liabilities. So I stepped in. I used the money I had been quietly investing for years. I created a holding company registered in Delaware, completely anonymous and perfectly legal. That company purchased the Buckhead house in full. I paused, turning my head to look directly at my soon-to-be ex-husband. He was practically shrinking into his expensive dining chair, sweat beading on his forehead. Marcus has not been paying a mortgage for the last 4 years, I announced, letting the truth wash over the room. Marcus has been depositing a monthly rent check directly into my corporate account. I own the house, every brick, every window, every blade of grass on the lawn. He is simply my tenant. And since he just served me with divorce papers and terminated our marital arrangement, his lease is officially month to month. Reginald's jaw dropped. He turned to Marcus, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. Is this true? He demanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl. Did you sign your house over to this woman? Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the room looking for a lifeline. Dad, I had to, he stammered, his voice pathetic and weak. The lawyers said I was going to lose everything in the lawsuit. Nia said she would keep it safe. I thought we were married. I thought what was hers was mine. You thought wrong, Tara chimed in, leaning back in her chair with a deeply satisfied smirk. In the state of Georgia, assets acquired by an LLC, owned solely by one party prior to the commingling of marital funds, remain separate property. You do not own a single doorknob in that house, Marcus. Suddenly, a loud, dramatic sob broke the tension. Everyone turned to look at Chloe. My white sister-in-law had her hands pressed against her cheeks, her eyes welling up with large performative tears. She looked at me as if I had just committed a violent crime right there in the dining room. "I cannot believe this!" Chloe cried out, her voice trembling with practiced theatrical distress. "I just cannot believe what I am hearing. Nia, how could you do this to him? How could you be so utterly deceitful?" I looked at her, completely unfazed by her weaponized waterworks. "Do what to him, Chloe? Protect him from going to jail and losing his shirt because he chose to drive drunk." "You are financially abusing him," Chloe declared loudly, standing up from her chair to maximize the dramatic effect of her tears. She walked around the table, placing a protective, comforting hand on Marcus's shoulder. "He is a vulnerable black man in a society that is already rigged against him, and you, his own wife, used his lowest moment to manipulate him. You tricked him into giving you his property. This is why successful black men have such a hard time building generational wealth. Because of toxic gold-digging women like you who just want to tear them down and steal what they have built." The sheer audacity of her statement hung heavy in the air. A wealthy white woman from a trust fund family was lecturing me, a black woman who built her own wealth from scratch, about the plight of black men in America, all while defending a man who had cowardly served me divorce papers at a holiday dinner. I felt Tara tense beside me, ready to absolutely annihilate Chloe, but I raised my hand slightly to hold her back. I turned to look at Chloe, dropping my polite smile entirely. "Save the white tears, Chloe," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. "We are indoors and the police are not here for you to weaponize your crying against me. Marcus is not a victim. He is a grown man who made a careless choice and relied on his wife to clean up his mess. I did not steal anything. I bought an asset he was about to lose. If you want to play the savior so badly, you can welcome him into your guest room tonight, because he is not coming back to my house." "How dare you speak to my daughter-in-law that way?" Vivian shrieked, slamming her palms down onto the table. The fine china rattled violently. Vivian stood up, her face twisted with a level of pure, unadulterated hatred I had never seen before. "Chloe is twice the woman you will ever be. She actually understands the meaning of family and loyalty." Vivian walked toward me, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "You have always been a manipulative, scheming little street rat. You clawed your way into our family because you saw a meal ticket, and when you realized you could not measure up to our standards, you decided to steal from us. You are a toxic, barren parasite, Nia." The room grew dangerously quiet again. Even Reginald seemed to hold his breath as Vivian crossed a line there was no coming back from. "It makes perfect sense now," Vivian continued, her voice dripping with venom, loud and piercing in the grand room. "It is absolute karma. God saw the ugly, selfish darkness inside your heart, and he punished you for it. That is why you cannot give my son a child. You are a broken woman. Your womb is a barren, dead piece of land that cannot even produce a single drop of life for the Sterling family. You are a failure as a wife, and you are a complete failure as a woman." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Tara gasped, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Chloe looked at Vivian with a mix of shock and twisted satisfaction. Marcus just stared at the floor, doing what he did best, absolutely nothing. They all waited for me to crumble. They waited for me to burst into tears, to run out of the room, humiliated by the ultimate insult. Instead, I looked at Vivian and I began to laugh. It started as a soft chuckle, but quickly grew into a genuine, full-throated laugh that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. I laughed so hard, I had to wipe a tear of pure amusement from the corner of my eye. Vivian looked at me as if I had completely lost my mind. "Dead land," I repeated, still chuckling as I reached back into my designer handbag. "A barren wasteland." "Wow, Vivian, you really have a way with words. It is almost poetic." I pulled out a crisp, white envelope with a medical clinic's logo embossed on the top left corner. I tossed it onto the center of the mahogany table, right on top of the signed divorce papers. "You call me a barren piece of land," I said, my voice dropping its amusement and turning terrifyingly cold. "You should tell your perfect, successful son to read the paper inside that envelope out loud to the entire room." Marcus stared at the crisp white envelope on the table as if it were a live grenade. His hands, which had been so steady while carving the holiday turkey just an hour prior, were now trembling so violently he had to pull them off the table and hide them in his lap. He knew exactly what was inside that envelope. I watched the heavy beads of cold sweat gather at his hairline, his perfectly groomed, wealthy executive facade completely melting away in front of his precious family. "Read it, Marcus," I commanded, my voice slicing through the thick, suffocating silence of the dining room. "Read it out loud to your mother who just called my womb a barren wasteland. Read it to your father who just handed me divorce papers for failing to produce a sterling heir." He shook his head tightly, his eyes darting frantically toward the floor, pleading with me in a silent, desperate panic. "Please, Nia, do not do this right now," he whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched rasp. The absolute cowardice of this man was staggering. For 4 long years, he had watched his family tear me apart piece by piece. He had let them insult my working-class background, mock my education, and constantly degrade my body, all to protect his own fragile, bruised ego. I reached across the table, grabbed the envelope, and pulled out the medical document from the most exclusive fertility specialist in Atlanta. "Since my husband has suddenly lost his ability to speak, I will be more than happy to share his official medical diagnosis with the rest of the class," I announced, unfolding the heavy paper with deliberate slowness. The sound of the paper crisping seemed to echo off the walls. "This is a comprehensive medical evaluation. It clearly states that Marcus suffers from complete irreversible sterility. He has absolutely zero viable sperm." The room erupted into a cacophony of loud gasps, but I immediately raised my voice just enough to overpower their shock. "And do you want to know the absolute best part about all of this, Vivian?" The doctor confirmed this permanent condition was caused by extensive unmonitored anabolic steroid abuse during his college fraternity days. Your perfect golden boy permanently sacrificed his ability to ever have children just to bulk up his muscles and impress his frat brothers at tailgate parties. I looked down at my husband, feeling a wave of pure, unadulterated disgust wash over me. "I let you all blame me," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy hush. "For years I smiled politely and nodded while you dragged my name through the mud at your country club luncheons. I let you call me less of a woman. I pumped my body full of painful hormone injections, endured highly invasive medical procedures, and sat crying alone in sterile clinic waiting rooms, all to maintain the illusion that I was the one with the problem. I protected his humiliating secret because I actually believed in the sanctity of our marriage vows. I took your relentless daily abuse to shield a weak, pathetic man who ultimately thanked me by orchestrating a public divorce at a Thanksgiving dinner over the very biological issue that he caused." Vivian stood up so fast that her heavy dining chair tipped backward and crashed violently onto the hardwood floor. "That is a lie," she shrieked, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. "That is a fabricated, disgusting, malicious lie. My son is a sterling. He is a healthy, virile man. You probably paid some shady back-alley clinic to print that garbage because you are a vindictive, barren woman trying to shift the blame for your own biological failures. You are a sick, twisted liar." Reginald was right beside her, his face turning a dangerous shade of dark purple with absolute fury. "You have completely lost your mind, Nia," he bellowed, pointing a thick, accusing finger directly at my face. "How dare you bring this kind of filthy slander into my home? The Sterling bloodline has never had a single physical defect in our entire history. We are built on strength, excellence, and legacy." Reginald pounded his fist against the table, rattling the crystal glasses. "Look at Jamal!" he shouted, gesturing grandly toward his eldest son. Jamal sat rigidly at the other end of the table, suddenly looking very small next to a noticeably pale Chloe. "Jamal is a true sterling. He gave me 2 strong, beautiful grandsons to carry on our family name and inherit our wealth. That is the reality of our superior genetics. You are just a bitter, desperate woman making up vicious lies to cover up the fact that you are fundamentally useless to this family." The sheer, blinding arrogance of his statement hung heavily in the air. They were so consumed by their own exceptionalism, so desperately clinging to the fabricated myth of their perfect, untouchable lineage, that they could not see the massive house of cards collapsing right in front of them. Tara leaned back in her chair, casually swirling the expensive red wine in her glass, a knowing, predatory smile playing on her lips. She knew exactly what I was going to do next, and she was thoroughly enjoying the show. I slowly picked up my own wine glass, savoring the rich aroma before taking a deliberate, unhurried sip. I swallowed, placed the crystal glass gently back onto the table, and shifted my gaze entirely away from Reginald and Vivian. I turned my head, locking my eyes directly onto my older brother-in-law. Jamal was suddenly sweating just as much as Marcus. He was gripping his cloth napkin so tightly his hands were shaking. Beside him, Chloe looked as though all the blood had been drained from her body. She looked like she was about to pass out entirely. Her previous weaponized white tears had completely dried up, replaced instantly by stark, genuine, paralyzing terror. She refused to meet my gaze, staring blankly at her half-eaten slice of sweet potato pie. I offered them both a razor-sharp smile, the kind of smile a predator gives right before it strikes. "That is a truly fascinating point, Reginald," I said smoothly, letting the heavy silence stretch out for maximum psychological impact. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my eyes locked dead on Jamal. "Are you absolutely certain those two little boys carry the Sterling bloodline, Jamal?" Jamal froze, his hand suspended halfway between his water glass and his mouth. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Vivian, who had been completely silenced by my first revelation, suddenly found her voice again, though it was noticeably shakier this time. "What kind of sick game are you playing now?" Vivian demanded, her voice shrill. "You are trying to deflect from your own barren reality by attacking my grandsons." I did not even look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Jamal. I reached into my purse one more time and pulled out a second envelope, this one stark white. I slid it across the table. It stopped right next to the remaining slice of pie on Jamal's plate. As the family accountant, I handled all the private medical billing for the Sterling estate. I explained, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. Reginald always insisted that any sensitive medical procedures be paid out of pocket, completely off the corporate insurance books, to ensure absolute privacy. It was a smart move, but it also meant I saw every single receipt, every single billing code, and every single doctor's note for the past 4 years. And when I decided to do a deep dive into the archives to prepare for tonight, I found something absolutely fascinating. Jamal stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "Open it, Jamal," I urged softly. With trembling hands, he picked up the envelope, tore the flap, and pulled out the single sheet of paper. His eyes scanned the document. I watched as the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His breathing hitched, becoming shallow and rapid. "Read it to your wife," I said, leaning back in my chair. Jamal could not speak. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He just stared at the paper, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. "Fine, I will save you the trouble," I said, turning my gaze to Chloe, who was now trembling violently in her seat. "That document is a certified medical record from a private men's clinic in Buckhead. It confirms that exactly 6 years ago, Jamal Sterling underwent a successful, permanent, and completely irreversible vasectomy." A collective gasp sucked the remaining air out of the room. "Jamal had the procedure right after your first son was born," I continued, my voice steady and relentless, "which makes perfect biological sense for your oldest child. But your youngest son, little Harrison, just turned 4 last month." The math hung in the air, cold and undeniable. 6 years ago, Jamal made sure he could never father another child. 2 years later, Chloe miraculously got pregnant with the second Sterling heir. Jamal dropped the paper. It fluttered to the mahogany table, landing face up for everyone to see. He turned his head slowly to look at Chloe. His eyes were wide, wild, and filled with a blinding rage that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Tell me it is a lie," Jamal whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying intensity. "Tell me she fabricated this, Chloe. Tell me you did not bring another man's bastard into my house and pass him off as my son." Chloe burst into a dramatic, hysterical fit of sobbing. It was the ultimate display of weaponized white tears, completely designed to make her look like the victim of a brutal attack rather than the architect of a massive deception. I had to do it, she wailed, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving with exaggerated sobs. You do not understand what it was like. You do not know the pressure I was under. Jamal erupted. He let out a guttural primal roar that shook the crystal glasses on the table. In one swift, violent motion, he lunged across the space between their chairs. His hands reached for her neck, his face twisted in absolute fury. You lied to me, he screamed, his fingers grappling at the collar of her expensive silk dress. For 4 years you looked me in the eye and let me raise another man's child. Marcus and Reginald immediately sprang into action. They rushed around the table, grabbing Jamal by the shoulders and pulling him back before he could fully wrap his hands around Chloe's throat. The three men crashed against the heavy oak buffet table, sending a silver serving tray clattering to the hardwood floor with a deafening crash. Get off me, Jamal roared, struggling against his father and brother. She played us. She played all of us. Chloe scrambled backward, her chair tipping over behind her. She backed away toward the grand staircase, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes flashing with a sudden vicious defensiveness. Do not you dare act like this is all my fault! Chloe screamed, pointing an accusing finger at Reginald and Vivian. You did this to me. You toxic, oppressive people forced me into this. Vivian clutched her chest, looking as though she might faint. We forced you to cheat on our son and lie about his child, she gasped. Yes, Chloe shrieked, dropping her perfect, polite, high society persona entirely. From the day I married into this family, all you cared about was the legacy. Reginald told me every single week that a true Sterling needed multiple heirs to secure the family wealth. He threatened to cut Jamal out of the primary trust if we did not have a second son. Jamal refused to get the vasectomy reversed because he was too obsessed with his own comfort. What was I supposed to do? I did it for us. I did it to protect our position in this sick, twisted family. Chloe crossed her arms, using her privilege and her tears as a shield, completely flipping the narrative to make the Sterlings the villains of her infidelity. You people are a nightmare, she cried out. You measure everyone's worth by their blood and their bank accounts. I gave you exactly what you demanded. I gave you your precious second heir. You should be thanking me for saving Jamal's inheritance instead of attacking me like a pack of wild animals. The sheer delusion of her justification left the room completely paralyzed. Reginald let go of Jamal, his chest heaving as he stared at the woman he had praised just 20 minutes earlier as the perfect wife. His entire worldview, his obsession with his pure, untouched bloodline, had just been ripped apart and stomped on by the very woman he thought was securing his legacy. Reginald's face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He turned around, grabbed the crystal wine glass from the table, and hurled it violently against the dining room wall. The glass shattered into hundreds of pieces, spraying red wine across the expensive custom wallpaper like a splash of blood. Enough, Reginald roared, his voice booming with a terrifying authoritarian finality. Everyone shut your mouths right now. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto me. The veins in his neck were bulging. He looked like a man who had been pushed entirely past his breaking point. He marched back to the head of the table, slamming both of his heavy fists down onto the mahogany surface. You did this, he snarled, spitting the words at me. You came into my home on Thanksgiving, and you deliberately set out to destroy my family. You think you are so smart, Nia. You think because you pulled a fast one with Marcus's house and dug up some dirty medical files that you have somehow won. I sat perfectly still, my posture straight, letting him rage. You are nothing, Reginald shouted, leaning over the table toward me. You are a little girl from the South Side who got lucky, and now you have overplayed your hand. You think you can embarrass me in my own home and walk away unscathed. Tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, I am calling my bankers. I am freezing every single joint account Marcus has. I am calling my legal team, and we are going to bury you in so much litigation you will not be able to afford a cup of coffee. I am going to use the entire weight of the Sterling real estate empire to crush you into dust. You will be ruined. The silence that followed his threat was heavy and dangerous. Reginald stood tall, breathing heavily, convinced he had just regained complete control of the room. He truly believed his money and his power were enough to erase the absolute devastation I had just unleashed upon his family. Beside me, Tara finally moved. She elegantly crossed one leg over the other, picked up her wineglass, and took a slow, appreciative sip. She lowered the glass, wiped a single drop of wine from her lip, and offered Reginald a dark, highly amused smirk. She looked Reginald dead in the eye, her voice dripping with absolute corporate condescension. What empire, Reginald? Reginald's face twisted into a mask of pure disbelief. He leaned his heavy frame against the edge of the dining table, his knuckles turning white as he stared down my best friend. He let out a harsh, patronizing bark of laughter, the kind of sound a man makes when he is entirely too used to getting his way. You have got a lot of nerve coming into my dining room and talking to me like that little girl. Reginald snarled, his voice vibrating with unchecked aggression. You clearly have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I am Reginald Sterling. I have spent 30 years building a billion-dollar commercial real estate portfolio in this city. I own half the high-rises in Midtown. I play golf with state senators, and I have federal judges on speed dial. I am a pillar of the Atlanta business community. If I make one phone call tomorrow morning, I will have your law license revoked before you even finish your morning coffee. Tara did not flinch. She simply sat there radiating the calm, lethal confidence of a corporate litigator who ate arrogant billionaires for breakfast. She picked up her cloth napkin, dabbed her lips gracefully, and tossed it onto her empty dessert plate. A billion-dollar portfolio. Tara repeated, her voice smooth and dangerously quiet. That is a fascinating number, Reginald. It looks beautiful on your glossy company brochures and your country club applications. But it is incredibly strange how your public valuations never seem to match the actual liquid capital running through your operating accounts. Vivian gasped, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with her husband. How dare you speak to him that way? She hissed, her diamond earrings shaking as she trembled with rage. You and your little bookkeeper friend are completely delusional. You are just a pair of jealous low-class women trying to extort us because you know Nia is being thrown out on the street tonight. Tara turned her gaze slowly to Vivian. Bookkeeper Tara echoed, letting the word roll off her tongue with deep amusement. That is what you have been calling her for 4 years, is it not? A lowly desk accountant, a glorified human calculator who just files taxes for small businesses. Tara looked at me, a proud smile breaking across her face before turning her sharp eyes back to the Sterling matriarch. Vivian, your obsession with country club pedigrees and Ivy League degrees made you incredibly blind. You were so busy looking down your nose at Nia's state university education that you completely failed to verify what she actually does for a living. Nia is not a desk accountant. She is a senior forensic data auditor. She is a certified fraud examiner who contracts directly with federal agencies to dismantle white-collar criminal syndicates. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Marcus, who was still slumped in his chair looking like a beaten dog, suddenly whipped his head around to stare at me. His eyes were wide with a sudden, horrifying realization. I leaned forward, resting my elbows comfortably on the mahogany table, taking control of the room. For 4 years, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like glass, you made me the butt of your jokes. You mocked my clothes, you insulted my upbringing, and you constantly reminded me that I did not have your generational wealth. You thought I was quiet at these family dinners because I was intimidated by your massive Tuxedo Park mansion and your crystal chandeliers. I was not intimidated, Vivian. I was observing. I was working. Reginald's arrogant posture began to crumble. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the heavy brown envelope sitting in the center of the table. It all started 4 years ago. I continued, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. When Marcus drunkenly crashed his Porsche and begged me to hide this Buckhead house from a civil lawsuit, I had to completely restructure his personal financials to set up the anonymous LLC. But while I was inside his accounts, I noticed something very strange. Marcus is listed as the vice president of Sterling Real Estate, taking home a massive executive salary. Yet the funds paying his salary were not coming from legitimate commercial lease revenues. They were coming from a complex web of offshore holding companies. "Shut your mouth!" Reginald commanded, his voice suddenly losing its booming authority and cracking with genuine panic. "You are violating confidentiality. You are breaching your professional duties. I will sue you for everything you are worth." "I do not work for you, Reginald." I shot back, my voice rising to match his panic with pure authority. "I never signed a non-disclosure agreement with Sterling Real Estate. I am an independent auditor who just happened to share a bed with your cowardly son." And once I saw the glaring discrepancies in Marcus's accounts, I started looking into yours. I stood up from my chair, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor as I slowly paced behind Marcus. He shrank away from me, terrified. "I spent the last 3 years quietly following your money," I said, addressing Reginald directly. While Chloe was laughing at my homemade sweet potato pie and Vivian was bragging about her charity galas, I was downloading your corporate ledgers. I was tracing millions of dollars being shuffled between phantom investors in the Cayman Islands to artificially inflate the value of your commercial properties. You have been taking out massive bank loans against buildings that are practically worthless, using the new loan money to pay off the old investors to keep the illusion of wealth alive. Reginald was sweating profusely now. He reached for his tie, pulling at the expensive silk knot as if he were suddenly suffocating. His chest heaved and he looked wildly around the room, realizing that his entire family was watching his untouchable facade shatter into a million pieces. Jamal, who had just had his own life destroyed moments earlier, stared at his father with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "Dad," Jamal whispered, his voice shaking. "Dad, tell her she is lying. Tell her our company is solid." Reginald could not speak. He just stared at the heavy brown envelope on the table, his eyes locked on it as if it were a ticking time bomb. Tara stood up, joining me at the edge of the table. She reached out with one perfectly manicured hand and slowly pushed the heavy brown envelope right until it touched the edge of Reginald's empty dessert plate. "That is exactly why Nia spent the last 3 years tracking every single cent of your cash flow," Tara said, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the formal dining room. "She built a complete bulletproof dossier of your entire financial history." "Open the envelope, Reginald. What are your thoughts on the term Ponzi scheme?" Reginald stared at Tara, the muscle in his jaw ticking so furiously, it looked as though it might snap. He looked down at the thick brown envelope resting against his dessert plate. He wanted to ignore it. He wanted to sweep it off the table and continue barking orders, but the absolute certainty in Tara's voice had planted a seed of doubt in his arrogant mind. With a rigid, jerky motion, he snatched the envelope, ripped the top open, and pulled out the stack of documents. I watched his eyes scan the first page. It was a beautiful, meticulously detailed summary report I had personally compiled. It featured color-coded flowcharts, offshore routing numbers, and a comprehensive list of dummy LLCs registered in the Cayman Islands. He flipped to the second page. His hands began to shake. The thick, expensive paper rattled audibly against his gold cufflinks. He flipped to the third page and his face turned the color of wet ash. "You have not turned a legitimate profit on a single commercial property in over 7 years. I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the dining room. "Your occupancy rates are entirely falsified. You have been soliciting capital from new private investors and using their buy-in funds to pay the guaranteed quarterly returns to your older investors. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme, and you have been running it right out of this very house." "This is fabricated garbage," Reginald choked out, though his voice lacked any of its usual booming authority. He was staring at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. "Every wire transfer is time-stamped, Reginald. Every routing number is verified by bank records." I pushed back, my tone completely unyielding. But my absolute favorite part of the entire investigation was not finding the fraud. It was tracking exactly how you managed to wash the dirty money before depositing it into your clean corporate accounts. I turned my attention to Vivian. She was still clutching her chest from Chloe's devastating confession, looking physically ill, but now her brow furrowed in confusion. "You always bragged about your philanthropic work, Vivian," I said smoothly. "Your lavish charity galas for the Atlanta Children's Initiative. Your prestigious sorority endowment fund. You raised millions every year from your high society friends. You loved standing on those stages in your designer gowns, accepting awards for your endless generosity. I do a lot of good for this city, Vivian snapped, though her voice wavered with sudden uncertainty. Your husband has been using your charity accounts as a washing machine, I explained slowly, letting the horror of the reality sink into her privileged bones. He funneled the illegal investor capital through your nonprofit organizations, disguising the deposits as anonymous philanthropic donations. Then he drafted fraudulent vendor contracts paying his own shell companies out of your charity funds for consulting services that were never actually rendered. Your entire social standing is built on federal wire fraud, money laundering, and charity embezzlement. Vivian grabbed the edge of the table. She looked like she had just been struck by lightning. She turned to Reginald, her eyes wide with a manic, suffocating terror. Reginald, tell me this is not true! Vivian gasped, her perfectly composed society facade shattering into a million jagged pieces. Tell me you did not use my sorority accounts. The federal government investigates charities. My name is on those foundation charters. I will go to federal prison. My friends will read about this in the papers. I will be completely ruined at the country club. We will be social pariahs. Shut up, Vivian! Reginald barked, his panic finally breaking through his arrogant exterior. He slammed the stack of forensic audits face down onto the table. Jamal, who had been standing frozen by the buffet table after his violent outburst at Chloe, suddenly stepped forward. His own personal nightmare was suddenly eclipsed by the realization that his financial lifeline was evaporating. Dad, Jamal whispered, his voice trembling with genuine fear. Is she telling the truth? If the feds look at the books, they will seize everything. They will seize our trust funds. We will lose the cars, the houses, everything. Reginald straightened his posture forcefully, adjusting the lapels of his tailored suit jacket in a desperate attempt to physically pull his authority back together. He took a deep, ragged breath and let out a harsh, mocking laugh that sounded completely hollow. You think a few spreadsheets are going to take me down, Nia? Reginald sneered, pointing a trembling finger at me. You think you can scare me with this little presentation? You are completely out of your depth. I am a titan in this city. I am too big to fail. He leaned his heavy hands on the table, a wild, manic gleam appearing in his eyes. You do not understand how corporate finance works at my level. Reginald bragged, his voice rising in volume as he tried to convince himself just as much as the rest of us. I have a safety net. I have Vanguard Capital backing me. They are a private equity firm out of Delaware with deeper pockets than you could ever possibly comprehend. I already had a closed-door meeting with their representatives last week. Reginald smiled, a desperate, ugly thing that stretched across his sweating face. Tomorrow morning, with one single phone call, Vanguard Capital is wiring a $50 million injection directly into Sterling Real Estate. It will completely cover the books, pay off the restless investors, and erase every single discrepancy you think you found. By the time you try to take this little file to the authorities, the money will be perfectly balanced. There will be no Ponzi scheme. There will be no missing funds. I am completely untouchable. The dining room fell silent again. Marcus finally looked up from the floor, a faint glimmer of pathetic hope flashing in his eyes. Vivian let out a long, shaky breath, clinging to her husband's promise of a $50 million bailout, like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. They all genuinely believed that Reginald's wealth and connections were about to magically erase years of federal crimes. I smiled. It was not a polite smile, nor was it an angry one. It was a smile of absolute, unadulterated triumph. I looked at Tara, who was mirroring my exact expression, her eyes dancing with wicked amusement. I turned my gaze back to the arrogant man standing at the head of the table. I folded my hands neatly on my lap, sitting perfectly straight. You really should read the fine print on those Delaware corporate registries, Reginald. Reginald frowned, his desperate smile faltering slightly. What are you talking about? I tilted my head, locking my eyes dead onto his. Who do you think is the anonymous owner of Vanguard Capital? Reginald blinked, his face completely devoid of color. The arrogant sneer that had permanently resided on his features for decades suddenly vanished, replaced by a hollow, uncomprehending stare. He looked at me, then at Tara, and then back to the brown envelope on the table. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. "Do you remember my father, Vivian?" I asked, shifting my attention to my mother-in-law, whose hands were currently trembling against her pearl necklace. "Do you remember the man you refused to let sit at the main table during our wedding reception because his rented tuxedo did not meet your ridiculous country club standards? You called him a peasant. You told Marcus that allowing a mechanic from the south side of Chicago to mingle with your high society friends was a humiliation you would never forgive." Vivian swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the room, completely stripped of her usual venom. "When my father passed away, shortly before Marcus and I got married, he left me a life insurance policy." I continued, my voice steady, ringing with the absolute authority of a woman who had finally backed her abusers into a corner. "It was a modest policy, $200,000. I remember you laughing about it, Reginald. You joked to your golf buddies that my father spent his entire pathetic life breaking his back just to leave me with pennies. You told Marcus to make sure I signed a prenuptial agreement because I was clearly a destitute gold digger looking to latch on to the sterling fortune." I stood up, walking slowly around the edge of the grand mahogany table. Marcus flinched as I passed him, pulling his legs tightly against his chest. "But I never touched your money, Reginald," I stated, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "And I certainly did not let my father's hard-earned pennies sit idle in a basic savings account. I used my background in financial auditing and forensic data to invest. I bought heavily into emerging tech startups before they went public. I purchased distressed commercial assets during the market dip and flipped them for massive margins. I quietly compounded that peasant money over and over again for the last 10 years, building a completely anonymous, highly aggressive investment portfolio." I stopped right behind Reginald's chair. I could smell the sharp, acrid scent of his nervous sweat. 3 years ago, Vanguard Capital was a struggling private equity firm looking for a quiet buyout. I said, leaning down slightly so my voice was right next to his ear. My holding company stepped in. I purchased an 80% controlling stake in the firm. I own Vanguard Capital, Reginald. Reginald grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in a violent, jerky motion. "No, that is impossible. I met with the senior partners. I sat in their boardroom in Delaware." "You sat in a boardroom with my salaried employees," I corrected him, stepping away to stand next to Tara, who was watching the old man crumble with deep, profound satisfaction. "My employees took your desperate phone calls. My employees reviewed your fabricated financial statements. And my employees recorded every single hour of your pathetic begging pitches. I sat in my home office listening to the audio files of the great untouchable Reginald Sterling, literally crying to my executives, begging for a $50 million lifeline to save his precious empire from collapsing into federal ruin." Reginald looked as though he were going to be physically sick. He slumped backward in his chair, all the fight completely drained from his massive frame. The illusion of his power, his wealth, and his absolute superiority had been entirely dismantled by the very woman he had thrown away like trash just an hour earlier. "You offered a 20% return on the investment," I continued, relentlessly driving the final nail into his coffin. "You offered the deeds to your personal estates as collateral, including this very mansion, which you do not even own anymore. You essentially handed over the keys to your entire life to a faceless corporation because you were too arrogant to realize you were walking straight into a trap." "Nia, please!" Vivian choked out tears, finally spilling over her heavily powdered cheeks and ruining her expensive makeup. "You cannot do this. We are your family. We took you in." "You did not take me in, Vivian! You took me hostage!" I snapped back, my voice turning to pure ice. "You used me as a prop to make yourselves look charitable, all while tearing down my self-esteem behind closed doors. You mocked my womb, you mocked my family, and you expected me to smile and thank you for the privilege of being abused. But the abuse ends tonight." I looked directly at Reginald, who was staring at the floor with dead, empty eyes. "I am officially withdrawing the term sheet," I announced, delivering the executioner's blow. I instructed my executive team to kill the deal an hour before I walked into this dining room. There will be no $50 million wire transfer tomorrow morning, Reginald. There will be no magical bailout to cover your massive illegal debts. Your private investors are expecting their quarterly dividend payouts by Friday afternoon. When your accounts come up completely empty, they will panic. They will trigger an immediate aggressive financial audit, and the federal authorities will be notified by Monday. Vivian let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The charity funds, she wailed, rocking back and forth in her chair. The sorority endowment. They are going to audit the charity funds. I am going to federal prison. I cannot go to prison, Reginald. You promised me the money would be replaced. You promised me. She turned her furious, tear-streaked face toward Marcus, who was silently weeping into his cloth napkin. This is your fault, Vivian shrieked at her youngest son, pointing a shaking finger at him. You brought this vicious, calculating monster into our home. You married a street rat who spent years plotting our absolute destruction. Marcus could not even formulate a response. He just shook his head, burying his face in his hands, completely paralyzed by his own cowardice and the catastrophic collapse of his entire world. The room descended into a suffocating, terrifying chaos. The Sterling family, once a pillar of Atlanta's elite high society, was now a fractured, broken mess of criminals, liars, and cowards. Their legacy was dead. Their wealth was a complete fabrication. And their pristine, untouchable reputation was about to become front-page news on every major media outlet in the country. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Jamal had been standing unnaturally still by the ruined buffet table, his chest heaving as he stared blankly at the wall. In the span of 30 minutes, he had discovered his wife was a fraud. His children belonged to another man. His multi-million-dollar trust fund was completely, entirely non-existent, and his freedom was about to be stripped away by a federal indictment. His entire existence had been erased. He slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto me. There was no rationality left in his gaze. The polished, arrogant real estate heir was gone, replaced by a cornered feral animal who had absolutely nothing left to lose. You! Jamal growled, his voice a low, guttural vibration that cut through Vivian's hysterical sobbing. You took everything from me. You took my sons. You took my money. You took my life. He took a slow, heavy step toward me. Reginald looked up, too paralyzed by his own ruin to intervene. Marcus shrank further into his chair, actively avoiding his brother's murderous glare. Chloe was backed into the corner by the staircase, clutching her designer dress and watching the scene unfold in muted horror. Jamal took another step. His hand reached out, his fingers wrapping tightly around the heavy, silver-handled turkey carving knife resting on the serving platter. The long, serrated blade glinted sharply in the light of the crystal chandeliers. I will kill you, Jamal roared, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unhinged violence. I will end you right here. He lunged forward, raising the heavy carving knife above his head, letting out a primal scream of absolute rage. I stood my ground, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I did not flinch. I did not need to. Before Jamal could take another step, Tara calmly reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer. She pulled out her sleek smartphone, her thumb hovering casually over the screen. She did not raise her voice. She did not panic. She simply offered Jamal a cold, terrifyingly serene smile. I do not think you want to do that in front of our guests, Jamal, Tara said smoothly, pressing a single button on her phone screen. The heavy, soundproofed walls of the mansion could not block the sudden deafening noise that erupted from outside. The piercing, high-pitched wail of multiple police sirens shattered the quiet evening air, accompanied by the harsh, flashing glare of red and blue lights reflecting off the dining room windows. The front yard was entirely surrounded. The heavy oak front doors did not just open, they were violently breached. The deafening crash of a battering ram splintering solid wood echoed through the grand foyer, instantly followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots swarming the marble floors. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark Kevlar vests emblazoned with FBI and IRS in bold yellow letters poured into the formal dining room. They moved with terrifying, practiced precision. Flashlights cut through the dim, crystal-lit ambiance, and the deafening shouts of federal authorities completely drowned out Vivian's hysterical sobbing. Drop the weapon, Alid! Agent roared, stepping smoothly into the room with his service weapon drawn and leveled directly at Jamal's chest. Drop it right now and put your hands behind your head. Jamal, whose feral murderous rage had completely evaporated the second the front door splintered into pieces, instantly released the heavy silver turkey knife. It clattered against the expensive hardwood floor with a sharp metallic ring. He dropped heavily to his knees, interlacing his trembling fingers behind his head. His previous arrogant bravado was entirely replaced by the paralyzing cold reality of an armed federal raid taking down his family. Nobody moves. The lead agent commanded, his eyes sweeping the room to secure the perimeter, while his team rapidly fanned out across the house. Keep your hands where we can see them. Reginald, however, was fundamentally incapable of accepting defeat. His deeply ingrained billionaire mentality simply could not process the sight of law enforcement treating him like a common street criminal in his own dining room. He puffed out his chest forcefully, adjusting the lapels of his tailored suit jacket in a pathetic, desperate attempt to reclaim his shattered authority. He took a bold, indignant step toward the lead FBI agent. "What is the exact meaning of this?" Reginald bellowed, his face turning an angry mottled purple as he tried to project power he no longer possessed. "Do you have absolutely any idea whose house you just broke into? I am Reginald Sterling. I play golf with the governor of this state. I have federal judges on speed dial. I demand you lower your weapons and leave my property immediately, or I will personally ensure every single one of you loses your badge by tomorrow morning." The lead agent did not even blink at the empty threats. He holstered his weapon smoothly and pulled a thick, official-looking document from his tactical vest, unfolding it with sharp, deliberate movements. "Reginald Sterling." The agent stated, his voice completely devoid of any emotion or intimidation. "We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant for this property, as well as the corporate offices of Sterling Real Estate. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive corporate tax evasion, money laundering, and operating a fraudulent investment scheme." Reginald let out a harsh, patronizing bark of laughter, though his hands were shaking violently against his sides. "This is a massive misunderstanding," he scoffed, pointing a furious, trembling finger at me. "That woman is a disgruntled gold-digging ex-wife. She fabricated those spreadsheets to extort my family because my son is divorcing her. You cannot possibly bring a federal raid to my home based on her amateur, vindictive little revenge plot." Tara stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. She radiated the absolute lethal confidence of a corporate shark who had just won the ultimate high-stakes game. "They did not act on a revenge plot," Reginald Tara said, her voice cutting through the chaos with crystal clarity. "They acted on a fully verified 200-page forensic audit. As a licensed officer of the court, I personally submitted Nia's complete financial dossier to the regional director of the FBI and the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS exactly 48 hours ago. Your offshore accounts have already been frozen. Your Cayman's proxy servers have been seized by international authorities. The federal government has been tracking your desperate, panicked wire transfers for the last 2 days. They have absolutely everything." Reginald staggered backward as if he had been physically struck by a heavy blow. The blood drained from his face entirely, leaving him looking pale, ancient, and completely broken. The $50 million Vanguard Capital lifeline he had bragged about was a phantom. His offshore money was frozen. His untouchable empire was dead. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the FBI agent ordered, stepping forward with a pair of heavy steel handcuffs glinting in the light. "Wait, no, you cannot do this to him!" Vivian shrieked, throwing herself between the agent and her husband. Her diamond earrings shook wildly as she clawed desperately at the agent's tactical vest. "He is a pillar of the Atlanta community. We host massive charity galas. We fund the children's hospital. You cannot treat us like common thugs. We are the Sterlings." A female IRS agent stepped up gently but firmly, pulling Vivian away from the arresting officer. "Ma'am, you need to step back right now. Your charity foundation charters are currently being seized and investigated as well. We have substantial, irrefutable evidence indicating those nonprofit accounts were actively utilized to launder illicit investor funds. If you interfere with this arrest, you will be detained for obstruction of justice." Vivian gasped loudly. her hands flying to her mouth in pure, unadulterated horror. The reality of her beloved pristine social standing collapsing into a federal money laundering scandal finally broke her completely. She sank into her dining chair, weeping hysterically, her carefully curled hair falling across her face in a messy, disheveled tangle. Her entire life of country club lunches and high society prestige was over. The sharp click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around Reginald's wrists echoed loudly in the room. The metallic sound seemed to snap something fundamental inside the sterling patriarch's mind. The realization that he was actually going to be dragged out of his multi-million-dollar mansion in front of his wealthy neighbors, shoved into the back of a police cruiser, and thrown into a federal holding cell, pushed him into a state of absolute frantic desperation. He frantically searched the room for a scapegoat, for any possible way to preserve his own skin and shift the blame. His wild, panicked eyes landed directly on Marcus. Marcus was still cowering in his seat, watching his father being handcuffed with wide, terrified eyes. He had spent his entire life hiding behind his father's money, nodding along to every cruel joke, and sacrificing my dignity just to keep his comfortable place in the family will. Now the man he had worshipped and feared was looking at him with a predatory, calculating gleam. Marcus Reginald barked, his voice cracking with panicked, intense desperation. Marcus, listen to me right now. You are the vice president of Sterling Real Estate. Your name is on all the commercial lease agreements. Your signature is on the offshore wire transfers. You manage the daily operating accounts. Marcus blinked rapidly, his face twisting in sudden, terrifying confusion. Dad, what are you talking about? You told me to sign those papers blindly. You told me they were standard corporate tax shelters. I never actually managed the accounts. You kept all the ledgers locked away in your private safe. Shut up and listen to me, Reginald commanded, completely abandoning any remaining shred of paternal loyalty. He was a cornered rat, fully willing to chew off his own limb to escape the trap. I am the founder of this company. I am too important to go down for this. You need to take the fall. Tell the agents you acted completely alone. Tell them you embezzled the funds behind my back to support your lavish lifestyle. Tell them you orchestrated the entire fraudulent scheme. Dad, no. Marcus whimpered, shaking his head violently as thick tears began to stream down his face. No, you cannot ask me to do that. I will go to federal prison for decades. I will lose everything. You owe me! Reginald screamed, his face turning red as he strained against the FBI agent's firm grip. I paid for your expensive cars. I paid for this house. I bought your worthless, pathetic life. You are a spineless coward who could not even keep his own wife in line when she started snooping around our servers. The absolute least you can do is protect the family name. Admit it right now. Tell them you are the one running the scheme. The utter depravity of the demand hung heavily in the air. Reginald Sterling, the great patriarch who demanded absolute loyalty and respect, was actively attempting to throw his youngest son into a federal penitentiary just to save himself. It was a stunning display of pure, unfiltered narcissism. Marcus sat completely paralyzed in his chair. He looked at his father, the man demanding he sacrifice his freedom. He looked at his mother, who was sobbing too hard to even defend him. He looked at his brother Jamal, who was currently being handcuffed on the floor by another agent, completely ignoring his plight. For the first time in his pampered, pathetic life, Marcus realized that the family he had chosen over me did not actually care if he lived or died. They only cared about their own wealth and survival. Desperate, hyperventilating, and drowning in sheer panic, Marcus slowly turned his head to look at me. He looked at the woman he had married. The woman who had balanced his personal checkbooks, cooked his meals, and endured years of relentless psychological abuse from his family just to keep the peace. The woman he had gleefully agreed to throw out onto the street with nothing but a garbage bag full of clothes just an hour prior. Nia, please, Marcus begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. He reached a trembling hand out toward me across the long dining table. Please, Nia, you have to help me. You know I am too stupid to run a complex financial scheme like this. You know I just signed whatever he put in front of me without reading it. Tell them. Please tell the federal agents I did not do it. Show them the proof in your files. Do not let him send me to prison. I looked down at the man I had once thought I loved. I studied his tear-stained face, his trembling lip, and his absolute groveling desperation. There was no pity left in my heart. The well of compassion I had kept reserved for him had completely dried up, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. I crossed my arms over my chest, my posture perfectly relaxed and my expression entirely composed. "You always chose your father over me, Marcus," I said, my voice cold, flat, and completely devoid of mercy. "You sat at this very table and laughed while he called me a lowly desk accountant. You agreed to leave me destitute to protect his offshore money. You made your choice. Now enjoy the consequences of that choice." Marcus stared at me, the final sliver of his hope shattering into invisible dust. The realization that I was not going to save him, that I was going to let him sink with the corrupt ship he had helped build, finally broke him completely. The deep cowardice that had defined his entire existence suddenly twisted into a wild, frantic instinct for pure self-preservation. He looked at Reginald, his eyes wide with a sudden manic defiance. "No!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking loudly as he stood up forcefully from his chair, pointing a trembling finger directly at his father's chest. "I am not going to prison for you. I will not take the fall for your massive crimes." Marcus turned frantically toward the lead FBI agent, raising his hands high in the air in a desperate gesture of absolute surrender. "I will confess," Marcus yelled, tears flying from his face as he completely sold out the sterling patriarch to save his own skin. "I will tell you absolutely everything. I know exactly where my father hides the double accounting ledgers." The lead FBI agent did not miss a beat. He gestured sharply to two heavily armed officers standing near the foyer archway. "Secure the suspect," the lead agent ordered, his eyes locked onto Marcus. "Read him his rights and get him into a separate vehicle. We have a cooperating witness." The dining room erupted into absolute bedlam. Reginald, whose hands were firmly cuffed behind his back, violently thrashed against the physical restraint of the agent holding him. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He looked at Marcus, not as a father looks at a son, but as a predator looks at a rat that had just bitten him. "You treacherous, spineless little bastard!" Reginald roared, his booming voice cracking with a terrifying rage that made the crystal glasses vibrate on the ruined Thanksgiving table. "You dare open your mouth. You dare speak a single word against me. I gave you everything. I built this empire with my own bare hands, so you could live like a king, and this is how you repay me. You are a pathetic excuse for a man." Marcus stumbled backward, his hands instinctively coming up to shield his face even though Reginald was restrained. The sheer terror in Marcus's eyes was entirely genuine. He was weeping openly now, gasping for air as two federal agents flanked him, firmly gripping his arms. "I am not going down for your arrogance, Dad," Marcus screamed back, his voice pitching into a hysterical squeak. "I am not taking the fall for your Cayman accounts. I did not set up the shell companies. You did. You forced me to sign those operating agreements. You told me it was just standard tax avoidance. You lied to me. You are a vice president of the company, you sniveling coward." Reginald spat, practically foaming at the mouth as he strained against the FBI agent pulling him toward the door. "You gladly took the $1 million bonuses. You gladly drove the luxury cars. You happily spent the money I washed for you. You do not get to play the victim now. You are going to prison, Marcus. I will make sure they bury you under the jail. I will spend every last dime I have hidden away to hire the best defense team in the country, and I will pin every single fraudulent wire transfer directly onto your forehead." Marcus shook his head violently, turning frantically toward the lead investigator. "He keeps a physical ledger." Marcus babbled the words spilling out of his mouth in a desperate, rapid-fire confession. He does not trust digital servers for the real numbers. There is a hidden wall safe in his private study upstairs. It is behind the mahogany bookshelf. The combination is my mother's birth date followed by the year they founded the company. The ledger has every real name, every fake vendor, and every offshore account number. I can give you the passwords to the Geneva accounts. I can give you the names of the bank managers. Just give me immunity. Please, you have to give me immunity." "Shut your mouth!" Reginald bellowed, his voice echoing through the entire house like a thunderclap. I should have left you with nothing. I should have cut you out of the will the day you married that low-class calculating witch. You are no son of mine. You are a parasite. I stood perfectly still, watching the glorious, utter destruction of the Sterling family empire. I did not need to say a single word. I did not need to lift a finger. They were doing the work for me. The foundation of their entire existence was built on greed, arrogance, and a deeply ingrained superiority complex. Now that the money was gone, and the threat of a federal penitentiary was staring them in the face, their precious family loyalty evaporated into thin air. They were tearing each other to pieces, like starving wolves fighting over a scrap of meat. Tara leaned toward me, her arms crossed comfortably over her chest. This is significantly better than any reality television show, Tara murmured quietly, her eyes dancing with profound amusement. I think Marcus might actually wet his pants before they get him to the squad car. I offered a small, cold smile. He always was a coward, I replied softly. It was only a matter of time before he turned that cowardice outward. On the floor near the shattered remains of the buffet table, Jamal let out a low, agonizing groan. He was lying on his stomach, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, while an armed agent stood watch over him. The feral rage that had driven him to pick up a carving knife had completely vanished, replaced by the crushing reality of his situation. He turned his head sideways against the hardwood floor, watching his father and brother scream at each other. Jamal had lost his trust fund. He had lost his fake children. He had lost his unfaithful wife. And now he was watching his father being hauled away in handcuffs. The golden child of the Sterling family, the untouchable real estate heir, was reduced to a criminal lying in a puddle of spilled gravy. Take them all out, the lead agent commanded, gesturing toward the front door. We have the warrants. Start tearing this place apart. Vivian, who had been sitting frozen in her chair, suddenly let out a strangled, breathless gasp. The sight of federal agents marching her husband and her youngest son out of the dining room finally shattered the last remaining wall of her denial. The flashing blue and red lights from the fleet of police cruisers outside illuminated the tears streaming down her heavily powdered face. The reality of her total social and financial ruin was crashing down upon her shoulders with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. She looked wildly around the dining room. She saw me standing tall and victorious. She saw Tara holding the phone that had summoned the raid. She saw the federal agents beginning to pull files from the cabinets in the adjoining hallway. She was cornered. Her money was gone. Her husband was arrested. Her charity was exposed as a fraudulent money laundering front. Her panicked, desperate eyes landed on the only person left in the room who had any connection to wealth and power. Chloe. Chloe was pressed tightly against the far wall by the grand staircase, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She was clutching her expensive designer dress, her eyes wide with a cold, calculating fear. She had watched the entire scene unfold with the pragmatic, ruthless survival instinct of a woman who knew exactly when to abandon a sinking ship. Vivian stumbled out of her chair. Her legs gave way, and the proud, arrogant matriarch of the Sterling family literally fell to her knees on the hardwood floor. She scrambled forward, her expensive diamond earrings shaking as she reached out with trembling hands. Chloe, Vivian sobbed her voice, a pathetic, high-pitched whine as she grabbed the hem of Chloe's dress. Chloe, please, you have to help us. Chloe stared down at her mother-in-law, her expression unreadable. Call your parents, Vivian begged openly, groveling on the floor. Tears and mascara stained her cheeks. Her carefully styled hair was a ruined mess. Call your father right now. He is a prominent surgeon. He has political connections. Your family has money. They know the state senator. They know judges. Beg them to post our bail. Beg them to hire a defense team for Reginald. We can fix this, Chloe. We can use your family's influence to make this go away. Please, you have to save us. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. I watched with clinical fascination. Vivian, the woman who had spent 4 years mocking my lack of a prestigious pedigree, The woman who had constantly reminded me that I did not belong in her elite circle was now on her knees begging a woman who had just confessed to having an affair with a tennis instructor. Vivian's desperation had completely stripped her of her pride. Chloe looked down at the weeping woman clutching her dress. She looked at Jamal, her husband who was currently being hoisted to his feet by an FBI agent. She looked at the flashing police lights illuminating the grand foyer. Slowly, deliberately, Chloe reached down and grabbed Vivian's trembling wrists. With a forceful, violent jerk, Chloe yanked her hands away, breaking Vivian's grip entirely. Vivian gasped, falling forward slightly, looking up at her daughter-in-law with wide, confused eyes. "Chloe, what are you doing?" Chloe stepped back, smoothing the fabric of her designer dress. Her face was completely pale, but her eyes were devoid of any warmth or sympathy. There was only a ruthless, cold pragmatism shining in her gaze. She reached into her expensive handbag and pulled out her smartphone. "I will call a lawyer," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a flat, emotionless tone that cut through Vivian's sobs like a razor blade. "But not for you." Vivian remained on her knees, her hands suspended in the empty air where Chloe had just brutally shaken them off. She stared up at her daughter-in-law, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The grand matriarch of the Sterling family, a woman who had spent decades meticulously curating an image of absolute perfection and untouchable grace, was now just a broken, sobbing woman kneeling in a puddle of spilled water and shattered crystal. Chloe did not even look down. She stepped around Vivian as if stepping over a pile of garbage on the sidewalk. She smoothed the front of her designer silk dress, took a deep breath, and completely transformed her entire demeanor in the span of 3 seconds. The cold, calculating pragmatism vanished from her eyes, instantly replaced by wide, terrified innocence. Her lower lip began to tremble perfectly on cue. Heavy, glistening tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over her pale cheeks. It was a masterclass in toxic, weaponized fragility. She walked directly toward the lead FBI agent, who was currently directing 2 officers to secure the hallway. She wrapped her arms tightly around her own torso, shrinking her posture to make herself look as small and defenseless as possible. Officer Chloe sobbed, her voice pitching up an entire octave into a breathy, frantic whimper. "Officer, please, you have to help me. I had absolutely no idea. I swear to you on my life, I knew nothing about any of this. You have to get me out of here." The lead agent turned, holding up a hand to signal his officers to pause. He looked at Chloe with a hardened, professional skepticism, but Chloe pressed her advantage immediately, leaning into her performance with terrifying ease. "My name is Chloe Kensington," she cried deliberately, using her maiden name and ensuring her pronunciation was sharp and clear. "My father is Dr. William Kensington. He is the chief of surgery at Emory. We are a respectable, law-abiding family. I was tricked into marrying into this nightmare. They lied to me. They all lied to me." She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at Jamal, who was still pinned to the hardwood floor by a tactical agent. "He told me he was a legitimate real estate developer." Chloe wept, her voice echoing loudly over the sounds of agents tearing through the adjacent rooms. "He told me his family was old money. I trusted them. I thought they were respectable business people, but they are just thugs. They are criminals who put on expensive suits to play pretend. I should have known better. I should have known better than to trust my black in-laws when their accounting never made any sense. They used my good name. They used my family's pristine white-collar reputation to legitimize their street hustle. They held me hostage in this fraudulent marriage." The silence that fell over the dining room this time was entirely different. It was not born of shock or fear, it was born of absolute suffocating disgust. The subtle, insidious microaggressions that Chloe had weaponized for years. The quiet implications that she was somehow genetically and socially superior to the family she had married into had just violently mutated into blatant, undeniable racism. She was using her status as a wealthy, crying white woman to explicitly distance herself from a wealthy black family that was currently surrounded by armed federal agents. She was throwing the Sterlings completely under the bus, stripping away their high society veneer to paint them as nothing more than sophisticated street thugs who had trapped an innocent girl. Reginald, who was being hauled to his feet by two agents, stopped struggling. He stared at the woman he had personally selected for his eldest son, the woman whose country club pedigree he had practically worshipped, with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Jamal thrashed wildly against the floor, his face contorting with a fresh wave of agony. "You treacherous racist snake," Jamal screamed, spitting blood onto the marble tiles as the agent pressed a knee firmly between his shoulder blades. "You spent my money faster than anyone. You knew exactly where the funds were coming from. You loved the street hustle when it bought your diamonds, you hypocrite." Chloe ignored him completely, keeping her tear-filled eyes locked onto the lead FBI agent. "I will cooperate fully," Chloe pleaded, reaching out to lightly touch the agent's armored sleeve. "I know where Jamal keeps his private offshore routing numbers. I know the passwords to his encrypted laptops. I will give you absolutely everything you need to lock him away for the rest of his life. I just want full legal immunity. You have to write it down right now. Give me immunity, keep my family's name out of the federal indictments, and let me walk out of that front door. I am a victim here." Tara crossed her arms, standing next to me with a look of profound revulsion. "The absolute audacity," Tara murmured, shaking her head. "She is trying to plea bargain her way out of federal conspiracy charges, using white tears and pure racism." I did not respond. My eyes were fixed on Vivian. Vivian was still kneeling on the floor, but the tears had stopped. Her chest was heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The woman had lost her untouchable husband to the FBI. She had lost her youngest son to cowardice. She had lost her eldest son to a violent, feral breakdown. She had lost her entire fortune to me. But Chloe's racist betrayal, the blatant, disgusting reduction of the proud Sterling legacy to a mere street hustle, was the absolute final straw. Vivian's entire body began to tremble. A low, guttural sound clawed its way up her throat, building into a deafening, blood-curdling shriek. "You ungrateful, opportunistic parasite!" Vivian roared. With a burst of adrenaline fueled entirely by raw, psychotic fury, Vivian scrambled to her feet. She did not hesitate. She lunged forward with terrifying speed, launching her entire body weight directly at Chloe. Chloe barely had time to turn her head before Vivian collided with her. The two women crashed into the heavy wooden serving buffet, sending silver platters, crystal decanters, and what remained of the Thanksgiving dinner shattering across the floor. Vivian landed on top of her daughter-in-law, her manicured fingers curling like claws as she viciously grabbed handfuls of Chloe's perfectly styled blonde hair. "You took our money," Vivian screamed, her face twisting into a mask of pure madness as she violently slammed Chloe's head against the hardwood floor. "You took our jewelry. You lived in our houses. You are nothing but a gold-digging leech. I elevated you. I brought you into my home." Chloe shrieked in genuine terror, flailing wildly as she tried to protect her face from Vivian's scratching nails. "Get her off me!" Chloe sobbed, kicking her expensive heels against the broken glass. "Help me! She is crazy!" Three federal agents immediately abandoned their posts, sprinting across the room to intervene. It took the combined strength of two heavily armored men to physically pry Vivian off her daughter-in-law. Vivian kicked and thrashed, her diamond earrings flying off her ears and scattering across the room as the agents forcefully slammed her against the wall, wrenching her arms behind her back to apply the steel handcuffs. "Let me go!" Vivian howled, her voice cracking as she fought against the restraints. "She is a traitor. She is a racist, filthy traitor. Take her to the transport van right now," the lead agent commanded, wiping sweat from his forehead as he gestured toward the front door. "Get them all out of here. This scene is completely out of control." The officers dragged Vivian out of the dining room. Her hysterical screams echoed down the long hallway, slowly fading into the flashing blue and red chaos of the front yard. Reginald and Marcus were marched out right behind her, their heads bowed in total defeat, effectively ending the reign of the Sterling family empire in a parade of federal handcuffs. Chloe was left sitting on the floor amidst the wreckage of the buffet. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged movements. Her designer silk dress was torn at the shoulder and stained with spilled cranberry sauce. Her hair was a disheveled, tangled mess. The pristine, untouchable aura she had maintained for years had been violently, literally ripped away. She looked around the room, realizing that the FBI agents were no longer paying any attention to her fragile victim routine. They were busy securing the digital devices and bagging the physical evidence I had outlined in my audit report. The show was over. Slowly, Chloe pushed herself up from the floor. She did not cry anymore. The toxic tears dried up instantly, replaced by a cold, hardened glare of pure, unadulterated selfishness. She brushed the dirt and glass off her ruined dress, adjusting the torn fabric over her shoulder with jerky, angry movements. She marched over to the entryway console table and snatched her exotic Birkin bag, tossing it over her arm. Then she reached for her neck. Resting against her collarbone was a spectacular, heavy diamond necklace. It was the famous Sterling family heirloom, a piece valued at over $200,000, which Vivian had formally presented to Chloe on the day of her wedding to Jamal as a symbol of her acceptance into the family dynasty. It was purchased with the stolen, laundered money of innocent investors. Chloe adjusted the heavy clasp of the diamond necklace, ensuring it was securely fastened around her throat. She gripped the handle of her designer bag and turned toward the front door, stepping over the scattered remnants of the Sterling family Thanksgiving. "I am leaving," Chloe announced to no one in particular, her voice dripping with venomous disdain. "I am calling my father's lawyers and I am severing all ties with this name. You people are absolute irredeemable trash." She took 2 confident steps toward the grand foyer, fully intending to walk out of the house and back into her privileged, wealthy life without facing a single consequence for the millions of dollars she had happily spent. She did not make it to the 3rd step. I moved with quiet, deliberate speed, stepping directly into the center of the archway. I blocked her exit completely. Chloe stopped short, her eyes flashing with sudden defensive anger. "Move out of my way, Nia!" Chloe demanded, her voice sharp and arrogant. "The federal agents already said I can go. I have absolutely nothing to do with you or this fraudulent family anymore." I did not move a single inch. I looked at the torn designer dress, the panicked eyes, and the heavy, glittering diamonds resting against her pale skin. I offered her a slow, freezing smile that held absolutely zero warmth. "You can leave, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that cut straight to the bone. "But that necklace stays." "Are you out of your mind?" Chloe scoffed, her voice shaking but dripping with pure aristocratic entitlement. She clutched the heavy diamond pendant resting against her collarbone, taking a defiant step backward. "This is a family heirloom. Vivian gave this to me as a welcoming gift. It has absolutely nothing to do with your psychotic revenge plot or this ridiculous federal raid. Move out of my way before I call my father and have you arrested for assault." "It is not a family heirloom, Chloe," I corrected her gently, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed while her panic visibly escalated. "Vivian bought that necklace from a private, exclusive jeweler in Buckhead exactly 4 days before your wedding, and I know exactly how she paid for it." I turned my head slightly, catching the attention of the lead FBI agent, who was currently directing his team to tag a massive stack of encrypted hard drives near the base of the grand staircase. "Agent," I called out, my voice clear and authoritative over the din of the ongoing raid. "If you cross-reference page 47 of the asset forfeiture manifest I provided to your director, you will see a highly detailed trace on a $200,000 wire transfer. The funds were moved directly from Sterling Real Estate's operational accounts, washed through a Cayman Islands shell company, and wired directly to a luxury jeweler in Atlanta to purchase that exact necklace." The lead agent immediately stopped what he was doing. He signaled to a female officer, and the 2 of them walked over, their eyes locking instantly onto the glittering diamonds resting around Chloe's neck. Furthermore, I continued, stepping closer to Chloe, who was now backing up against the wall in sheer terror. The 5-carat platinum engagement ring currently sitting on her left hand was purchased 3 months prior using the exact same offshore money laundering channel. Both of those pieces of jewelry are direct, verifiable proceeds of a federal crime. They are criminal assets purchased with stolen investor funds. The lead agent pulled a folded copy of the federal warrant from his tactical vest, his eyes scanning a specific list of high-value assets marked for immediate seizure. He looked up, his expression hardening into absolute stone. "Ma'am, you need to remove the necklace and the ring right now." The agent stated his tone, leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "They are classified as stolen corporate assets and are subject to immediate federal confiscation. Hand them over." "No!" Chloe shrieked, taking another step back until her shoulders hit the expensive wallpaper. Her hands flew up to cover her chest protectively. "You cannot do this to me. My father is a prominent surgeon. My family has money. We belong to the same country club as the governor. These are my personal belongings. You cannot just strip me of my jewelry like a common street criminal. I demand to speak to my lawyer. Remove the items immediately, or you will be placed under physical arrest for the possession of stolen funds and the active obstruction of a federal investigation." The agent commanded, his hand resting casually on his utility belt, as the female officer stepped forward with a heavy plastic evidence bag. "I will not ask you a second time." Chloe looked at the armed federal agents, then looked at me. Her chest heaved with panicked, ragged breaths. The crushing realization that her white-collar privilege, her father's medical degree, and her carefully curated high society status meant absolutely nothing to the federal government finally broke her defiant spirit. The invisible shield of superiority she had worn for years completely dissolved. Her hands trembled violently as she reached behind her neck. She fumbled blindly with the heavy platinum clasp, tears of pure, unadulterated humiliation streaming down her face and ruining her immaculate makeup. The clasp finally gave way. The heavy diamond necklace slipped from her pale skin, pooling heavily in her shaking hands. She held it out, dropping it into the thick plastic bag the female officer held open. The heavy thud of the diamonds hitting the bottom of the plastic sounded like a gavel falling in a silent courtroom. The ring, too, the lead agent demanded, completely devoid of any sympathy. Chloe sobbed openly now, a loud, ugly, guttural sound that echoed throughout the grand foyer. She grabbed her left hand violently, twisting the massive diamond engagement ring over her knuckle. It left a raw, red mark on her skin as she yanked it free and dropped it into the evidence bag alongside the necklace. She was entirely stripped of the sterling wealth. The glittering illusion of her elite status was gone, leaving her looking exactly like what she truly was: a fraud who had married for dirty money that never actually existed. Deprived of her diamonds, her wealthy husband, and her pristine reputation, Chloe completely lost her grip on reality. She let out a hysterical, high-pitched wail. She turned to run toward the open front door, desperate to escape the flashing police lights and the nightmare of the ruined mansion. But in her blind, frantic panic, her expensive designer stiletto caught the thick, raised edge of the Persian rug. Her ankle twisted sharply with a loud, sickening pop. Chloe screamed in pain, stumbling hard against the mahogany console table. She did not even try to recover her balance properly. Acting entirely on a feral, desperate survival instinct, she reached down and violently ripped the $5,000 shoes off her feet. She left them discarded on the floor next to the broken glass and spilled wine. Clutching her designer handbag tightly to her chest like a pathetic shield, Chloe Kensington sprinted out of the shattered front doors, completely barefoot, sobbing hysterically as she ran blindly into the cold, dark night. I watched her disappear into the shadows of the manicured lawn, feeling a profound, quiet satisfaction. The woman who had spent years treating me like dirt, judging my clothes and mocking my background, had literally run away from her own life without her shoes. "Keep moving," a harsh voice barked from the hallway. I turned to see Reginald being forcibly marched toward the front door by two federal agents. His hands were tightly cuffed behind his back, and his custom-tailored suit jacket was rumpled and pulled violently askew. The powerful, untouchable billionaire was being paraded through his own home like a common thug. As the agents pushed him toward the foyer, Reginald dug his heels into the marble floor, forcing them to pause for a brief second. His face was a mask of pure, venomous hatred. The veins in his neck bulged dangerously against his collar. He looked at the chaos around him, the seized corporate files, the ruined dining room, and finally his gaze locked entirely onto me. There was a desperate, manic fire burning in his eyes, the absolute refusal of a pathological narcissist to accept total defeat. You think you won? Reginald spat, his voice a low, gravelly growl that carried over the noise of the tactical raid. You think you destroyed me just because you froze my corporate bank accounts? You are nothing but a petty, vindictive little girl playing a massive game you do not even understand. I stood my ground, my hands resting casually by my sides. I did not blink, I did not flinch. I did. I have powerful friends. Reginald continued, spittle flying from his lips, as he strained against the heavy grip of the federal agents holding his arms. I have deep political connections that will have me out on bail before the sun even comes up. And once I am out, I will completely destroy you. I will tie you up in civil litigation for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life. You think I am ruined because Vanguard Capital pulled out of the buyout. You think I have nothing left. Reginald let out a harsh, breathless laugh, his eyes sweeping over the massive grand foyer, the crystal chandeliers, and the sweeping double staircase. I still own this estate, Reginald roared, his voice echoing with arrogant defiance. This house alone is worth $15 million in pure equity. I will liquidate this entire property by tomorrow afternoon. I will hire the most ruthless criminal defense team on the Eastern Seaboard, and I will personally see to it that you end up behind bars for corporate espionage. You took my cash, Nia, but you cannot touch my real estate. He glared at me, panting heavily, waiting for the fear to register on my face. He fully expected me to cower. He expected the mention of his massive tangible real estate asset to remind me of the immense generational power he still believed he held. He thought the Sterling mansion was his ultimate unbreakable shield. I tilted my head slightly, studying his desperate, sweating face. The silence stretched for 3 long, agonizing seconds as the red and blue police lights continued to flash across the marble walls. Then I slowly reached into the sleek leather bag resting on the console table beside me. I pulled out a single crisp, legally embossed document. It was the final nail, the ultimate inescapable trap I had set years ago when I first began quietly managing my anonymous investment portfolio. I held the document up, ensuring the federal agents holding him had a perfectly clear view of the official state seal stamped at the top of the page. Are you absolutely sure about that, Reginald? I watched Reginald's face cycle through stages of disbelief, incoherent fury, and finally a hollow, bone-deep terror. He stared at the document in my hand, as if it were a weapon pointed at his throat. The federal agents holding him paused, their grip tightening, as the atmosphere in the room shifted from a standard arrest to something far more terminal for the Sterling dynasty. That paper is a court-ordered foreclosure notice, I said, my voice cutting through the thick, suffocating tension of the room like a blade. I didn't just freeze your liquid assets, Reginald. I did my research. I knew exactly how heavily you leveraged your personal real estate to cover the shortfall at Sterling Real Estate over the last 3 years. You cross-collateralized this mansion, your vacation home in the Hamptons, and your private vineyard in Napa. I took a slow, measured step forward, ignoring the frantic, darting eyes of the remaining family members. You were so desperate to keep the illusion of your wealth alive that you didn't even notice when your primary lender sold off your non-performing loan portfolio to a third-party holding company. That holding company is a direct subsidiary of Vanguard Capital. I bought your debt, Reginald. I bought every single cent you owe. And as of this morning, the grace period on your defaulted loans has officially expired. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the FBI agents seemed to pause, intrigued by the sheer scale of the financial dismantling I had orchestrated. This mansion doesn't belong to the Sterling family anymore. I stated, my words ringing clearly against the high ceilings of the foyer. It belongs to me. It has belonged to me for the last 72 hours. And because this property is currently the subject of an active federal search and seizure warrant, your possession is no longer legitimate. I am giving you and your family exactly 24 hours to collect whatever personal items have not been tagged as criminal evidence by these agents. After that, you are trespassing on my property. Vivian, who had been sitting in a state of catatonic shock after her failed physical assault on Chloe, let out a long, shuddering gasp. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed entirely, her body sliding off the dining chair and hitting the marble floor with a dull, sickening thud. Vivian Reginald screamed, though he was powerless to move toward her as the agents tightened their control over him. Vivian, ignore her, the lead agent said, his voice cold and indifferent. She's breathing. Get the suspect into the vehicle. We have a lot of processing to do at the field office. Reginald was dragged toward the front door, his feet scraping uselessly against the expensive marble he had spent his life bragging about. As he was shoved toward the waiting police cruiser, he looked back at me one final time. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a frantic, animalistic rage that was completely unmoored from reality. "You think you won!" he spat, his voice strained and frantic as the cool night air hit him. "You think you've destroyed me just because you froze my accounts and bought my mortgage? You are nothing but a petty, vindictive little girl playing a game you don't even understand. I have deep political connections in this state. I have judges in my pocket. I will find a way to tie you up in civil litigation until you have nothing left. You think you've won, but I still have my name. The Sterling name is an institution." I didn't blink. I didn't need to. I reached into my handbag and pulled out one final thin slip of paper. It was a simple, starkly printed document that seemed almost underwhelming compared to the federal warrants and the foreclosure notices. I held it up, letting the dim light of the porch lantern catch the official seal. "You sure about that, Reginald?" I asked, my voice as calm as a summer breeze. "Because while you were busy trying to build an institution, I was busy auditing the Sterling Family Trust. And I found that you weren't actually the primary beneficiary for the last decade. You were a trustee. And the primary beneficiary just signed a formal notarized request to trigger the immediate dissolution of the trust and the clawback of all assets distributed under false pretenses." Reginald stopped struggling. The air seemed to leave his lungs in a single painful wheeze. He looked at the paper, then at me, and for the first time he truly realized he wasn't just losing his house or his company. He was losing his very identity. As the squad car door slammed shut on the Sterling patriarch, effectively ending his reign of terror and greed, I finally exhaled. The tension that had coiled in my chest for 4 long years dissipated. I turned back toward the dining room. Marcus was still on his knees, his face buried in his hands, shaking with great gasping sobs of pure, unadulterated cowardice. He had lost his father to prison, he had lost his house to foreclosure, and he had lost his future to the federal investigation. He was a man who had sold his integrity to maintain a lifestyle that was never his to begin with. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, his designer trousers stained with gravy and wine. He stopped at my feet, looking up at me with eyes that were red swollen and filled with a pathetic, groveling plea for mercy. "Nia," he whispered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, broken whine. "Nia, please. I am so sorry. I know I was a fool. I know I followed him blindly. You have to believe me, I never knew it was illegal. I would never have done it if I had known." I looked down at him. The man who had been my husband, the man who had sat by while his mother called me a peasant, the man who had greedily accepted every dollar of the fraudulent funds I was now auditing. "I am not going to file for the divorce," Marcus sobbed, clutching the hem of my dress with white-knuckled desperation. "We can fix this. I will fire his lawyers. I will help the FBI. I will do whatever you want. We can start over. We can go back to the way we were before all this. I promise I will be a better husband. I will listen to you. Just please, Nia, save me from this." He was clinging to me, his forehead pressed against my knee, his tears soaking through the fabric. It was a display of absolute pathetic desperation. He wasn't apologizing because he was sorry for the harm he had caused. He was apologizing because he realized I was the only person left in his life who wasn't currently facing a federal indictment. I stood there looking down at the man who had traded our marriage for his father's approval. I felt a strange, cold distance, as if I were observing this scene from a great height. Every promise of change, every plea for a fresh start, every word of apology sounded exactly like the script he had been reading for the last 4 years. I didn't pull away. I didn't kick him. I didn't shout. I simply waited until his breathing slowed, until he looked up at me with his wide, wet, hopeful eyes. "You think we can start over, Marcus?" I asked, my voice soft, calm, and utterly devoid of anything resembling warmth. He nodded fervently, his face bright with a sickening misplaced hope. Yes, Nia. We can. I will be whatever you need me to be. I leaned down, placing a firm hand on his shoulder, and spoke the final truth of our marriage. There is no we left, Marcus. There is only what I have reclaimed and what you are about to lose. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope that Reginald had so arrogantly slid across the table to me at the beginning of the evening. It was the original divorce settlement, the insulting, patronizing document that Marcus had spinelessly agreed to use to discard me quietly and efficiently. I held the stack of papers up, letting the harsh flashing lights from the police cruisers outside illuminate the thick legal text. I made sure Marcus could clearly see his own hasty signature already scrawled at the bottom of the page, a physical manifestation of his eagerness to throw me away. Slowly, deliberately, I gripped the top of the stack. With a sharp, violent motion, I tore the heavy parchment straight down the middle. The sound of ripping paper cut sharply through the surrounding chaos of the federal raid. I put the two halves together and tore them again, reducing the entire settlement to worthless shreds. I opened my hands, letting the torn pieces flutter down like dirty snow onto Marcus's gravy-stained trousers. Marcus gasped loudly, his breath hitching in his throat. A sudden, desperate light flooded into his bloodshot, terrified eyes. The crushing fear that had paralyzed his features just seconds ago was instantly replaced by a sickening, pathetic delusion of salvation. Nia Marcus breathed a trembling, hopeful smile, actually daring to stretch across his tear-streaked face. You tore them up. You tore up the divorce papers. You are giving me another chance. I swear to you I will make this right. I will cut them all off. It will just be you and me. We can go back to how we were. I let him savor that pathetic, fabricated hope for exactly 3 seconds. I watched the relief wash over his cowardly face, watching him convince himself that his usual routine of weaponized incompetence and begging had worked one last time. Then Tara stepped forward. Her movements were perfectly synchronized with mine executing a trap we had meticulously planned months in advance. She reached into the interior pocket of her tailored blazer and produced a sleek black leather folio. She snapped it open and offered it to me with a crisp, professional nod. I pulled out a fresh stack of documents. The stark white pages practically glowed in the dim light of the dining room. That original agreement, the one your father forced you to give me, was designed to protect the Sterling family assets, I explained, my voice turning to absolute unforgiving ice. But it contained a standard marital dissolution clause. It technically left you with 50% of our shared marital assets. It was a generous standard division of property that you did absolutely nothing to earn. I dropped the new stack of papers heavily onto the mahogany table right in front of his face. The sharp smack of the heavy paper hitting the wood made Marcus flinch violently. But this new agreement, I continued tapping the top page with a manicured fingernail, was drafted exclusively by my private legal team. And it comes with a comprehensive, fully verified addendum that proves you committed extensive financial fraud during the entirety of our marriage. Marcus stared at the new papers, his jaw dropping open. The brief, pathetic light of hope in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by a fresh, suffocating wave of horror. This document details every joint account you secretly drained to fund your gambling habits, I stated, delivering each word with surgical precision. It highlights the credit lines you fraudulently opened in my name to buy silence from your various mistresses. It contains irrefutable proof of the forged tax returns you filed, using my digital signature to hide your personal debts from your father. Nia, please. Marcus whimpered, shaking his head weakly, completely unable to form a coherent defense. You cannot do this. You cannot leave me with nothing. You will leave with absolutely nothing. I confirmed my tone, leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation or pity. Zero equity from our shared properties. Zero spousal support. Zero claim to any of the anonymous investments I have acquired. You are walking away from this marriage with empty hands. Actually, I corrected myself, offering him a cold, mocking smile. That is not entirely true. You are walking away with empty hands, plus a $50,000 debt for the back rent you currently owe me. Marcus blinked rapidly, his face twisting in utter confusion. Rent? He stammered, his voice breaking. What rent? We own our penthouse. We do not own the penthouse, Marcus, I replied smoothly. Sterling Real Estate leased that downtown penthouse through a corporate shell company because your father wanted to hide the asset from corporate taxes. What you did not know is that my holding company purchased that specific building 2 years ago. I am your landlord, Marcus. You have been living rent-free in my property funded by my investments while you brought other women into my bed. You owe me $50,000 in outstanding lease payments, and this divorce decree legally binds you to that debt. He was completely trapped. If he fought the divorce terms in family court, I would simply hand the massive binder of his personal marital fraud directly to the federal agents who were currently hauling his father out the front door. He would not just be facing a corporate conspiracy indictment alongside Reginald. He would be facing consecutive federal sentences for domestic wire fraud, identity theft, and tax evasion. Sign it, Marcus, I ordered, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. Sign the papers right now. If you hesitate for even 1 second, I will walk out of this dining room and hand this specific folder directly to the lead investigator. You will leave this house in handcuffs, just like your father. Tara silently unclipped an expensive silver pen from her leather folio. She tossed it onto the mahogany table. It rolled smoothly across the polished wood, coming to a dead stop mere inches from Marcus's trembling, sweaty hands. Marcus looked up at me one last time. He searched my face desperately, looking for any trace of the obedient, quiet woman who used to eagerly cook his dinners. He was looking for the woman who used to accept his empty apologies and endure his mother's endless cruelty just to keep the peace. He found absolutely nothing. That woman was dead and buried. In her place stood a wealthy, untouchable stranger who had just systematically dismantled his entire universe. With a ragged, broken sob that tore from the very bottom of his chest, Marcus reached out and picked up the silver pen. His hand shook so violently he could barely hold the instrument straight. Tears streamed down his face, dripping onto the pristine white paper and blurring the black ink. He pressed the pen to the signature line and hastily, sloppily scrawled his name across the bottom of the final page. He signed away his home, his wealth, and his entire future in a single pathetic stroke of ink. Tara stepped forward immediately. She swiftly retrieved the documents, checking the signature with a brisk clinical nod of satisfaction before sliding the papers safely back into her secure folio. A genuine pleasure doing business with you, Marcus, Tara said smoothly, her voice laced with sharp professional mockery. I did not say another word to him. I did not need to. I simply turned my back on the pathetic, ruined man sobbing uncontrollably on the dining room floor. Tara and I walked shoulder to shoulder toward the grand foyer. My heels clicked sharply against the expensive marble floors, the sound echoing with the absolute finality of a judge's gavel striking the block. The Sterling mansion was a chaotic, beautiful war zone. Armed federal agents were systematically tearing the house apart, hauling out boxes of physical ledgers, carrying encrypted computer servers, and ripping expensive artwork off the walls to check for hidden wall safes. The flashing red and blue lights from the fleet of police cruisers parked on the manicured lawn bathed the opulent foyer in a harsh, unforgiving strobe. Through the massive, splintered front doors, I could hear the sounds of absolute destruction. I could hear Vivian screaming hysterically from the back of a police transport van, mourning her dead socialite status. I could hear Reginald shouting empty, arrogant threats at the federal officers, reading him his Miranda rights. I could hear Jamal furiously cursing out his fleeing shoeless wife. I stepped out onto the wide front porch, pulling my tailored coat tightly around my shoulders against the crisp, cool evening air. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the scent of pine and absolute freedom. The Sterling real estate empire was completely dead. Their untouchable legacy was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. And I, the quiet, overlooked peasant from the south side of Chicago, was the one who had burned it all to the ground. I walked down the grand stone steps and disappeared into the night, leaving the Sterling family to rot in the ashes of their own miserable creation. The screen displays a crisp, high-definition broadcast of a news anchor, her voice steady and professional. 6 months have passed since the night the Sterling mansion was stripped bare. The footage shows Reginald Sterling being led into a federal penitentiary, his hair shorn, his signature arrogance replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a man serving a 20-year sentence for systemic financial fraud. The camera pans to a second clip, a crowded, chaotic courtroom, where Marcus, the former golden son of the Sterling dynasty, is sentenced to community service and mandatory wage garnishment. He is now seen working behind the counter of a cramped, low-rent coffee shop, his hands stained with espresso grounds, laboring to pay off the interest on his massive court-mandated debts. I set the tablet down on my desk, the black surface reflecting the morning sun. My office is located on the top floor of a sleek, glass-walled building in the heart of the city's business district. It is a far cry from the suffocating gilded cage of the Sterling estate. I scan the headlines of the Financial Daily. The Sterling collapse is being taught in business schools across the country as a cautionary tale of corporate greed and unmitigated hubris. My eyes linger on a small buried article in the Society pages. It features a grainy telephoto shot of Chloe Kensington. She is standing outside a run-down, dingy apartment complex in the suburbs, wearing an oversized, stained hoodie. Her blonde hair is unkempt, and her face is stripped of the heavy, expensive cosmetics that once masked her toxicity. She is locked in a loud, aggressive shouting match with Jamal. He looks emaciated, his eyes twitching with the telltale signs of a man deep in the throes of addiction. They are arguing over a crumpled handful of cash, the government-subsidized voucher they are desperately clawing over to pay for their next fix. Chloe's wealthy, prominent doctor father has publicly severed all legal ties, issuing a press release that described his daughter as a social pariah he no longer recognizes. She has been effectively excommunicated from the country club circles she once weaponized against me. The woman who looked down on everyone else is now fighting for scraps in the gutter of the life she manufactured. The intercom on my desk buzzes the soft melodic chime signaling that the world outside my office door is once again demanding my attention. "Ms. Nia, your 10 o'clock appointment has arrived," my secretary says, her voice smooth and polished. She is waiting in the executive lounge. I stand smoothing the front of my charcoal gray blazer. I walk to the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the city. Below me, the landscape has changed. The old Sterling real estate footprint has been absorbed by the city's urban renewal project, a transformation I facilitated with ruthless efficiency. The mansion they thought was their eternal fortress. It is no longer a monument to a defunct family. I spent the last 2 months overseeing a total redesign of the Sterling estate. I stripped away the gaudy gold leaf and the heavy, oppressive velvet drapes that Vivian loves so dearly. I replaced the dark, cavernous dining rooms with open-plan minimalist spaces designed for collaboration and light. The grand cold foyer is now a community gallery space showcasing the works of local artists who were previously ignored by the city's elite. The private ballroom has been converted into a non-profit technology incubator, providing resources to young entrepreneurs who, like me, have nothing but ambition and a vision for the future. The transformation is complete. It is no longer a symbol of exclusion and stolen wealth. It is a symbol of everything the Sterlings were not: accessible, transparent, and built on a foundation of actual value rather than criminal debt. I walk toward the executive lounge, the heels of my shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished concrete floor. Tara is already waiting by the door, holding the final architectural renderings of the property. She catches my eye, offering a small, knowing smile. "The foundation board is ready for you, Nia," Tara says, handing me the final blueprint. "They are going to love the changes." I nod, taking the folder. The transition from Sterling to the new center is the final step in my exit from their world. Everything I built, every bridge I burned, and every secret I uncovered has led to this exact moment. I am not just a survivor of the Sterling name. I am the architect of its erasure. I push the glass door open. A group of professionals stands to greet me, their faces lit with anticipation for what we are about to build together. I look past them toward the window that overlooks the old Sterling property in the distance. The ghost of Reginald's arrogance, Marcus's cowardice, and Vivian's cruelty have been entirely exorcised from the premises. I am Nia, and I am finally truly home. 6 months is a surprisingly short amount of time to completely erase a legacy, But when the foundation is entirely built on rot, the collapse is spectacularly fast. I sat at the head of a massive reclaimed oak conference table, the morning sun streaming warmly through the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. I flipped open the sleek leather-bound dossier my legal team had just delivered, savoring the crisp sound of the turning pages. The first section contained a neatly clipped article from the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The headline was brutal and uncompromising. It detailed how Reginald Sterling, a man who once believed he was completely untouchable, was currently wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He had been formally sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The presiding judge had been thoroughly unamused by his frantic, arrogant attempts to bribe his way out of federal conspiracy and money laundering charges. I turned the page, smoothing the paper flat. There was a grainy photograph taken by my private investigator just 2 days ago. Marcus, the former golden boy and heir apparent to a billion-dollar real estate dynasty, was captured wearing a stained green apron. He was frantically wiping down the counter of a busy low-end coffee shop in the financial district. He was working 60-hour weeks for minimum wage, forced to serve bitter espresso to the very same corporate executives he used to mock. Every single spare cent of his paycheck was garnished by a court-appointed trustee to pay off his massive restitution and the $50,000 he legally owed me purely to keep himself out of a federal jail cell alongside his father. The next page documented the pathetic downfall of Chloe Kensington. Her prominent doctor father had completely cut her off the very morning after the raid. He issued a ruthless public statement disowning her to save his pristine country club reputation from the toxic fallout of the Sterling criminal enterprise. Stripped of her trust fund, her stolen diamonds, and her elite status, she was now living in a cramped, mold-infested apartment complex on the far industrial edge of the city. According to the surveillance notes, she spent her days violently screaming at her ex-husband. Jamal had completely unraveled his former arrogance, replaced by a crippling substance addiction. The two of them were currently locked in a vicious, pathetic legal battle over a few $100s in government assistance vouchers, fighting like feral animals over absolute scraps in the gutter. I closed the folder, resting my hands flat against the polished wood. The quiet, profound satisfaction of absolute justice was a feeling I would never grow tired of. A soft, melodic chime echoed through the spacious room. I pressed the silver button on my sleek intercom system. "Ms. Vanguard." My secretary spoke, her voice crisp and deeply respectful. "The board of directors has arrived for the inaugural morning meeting." "Send them in," I replied, picking up my coffee cup. I stood up and smoothed the front of my tailored silk suit, walking toward the grand double doors of my office. This beautiful, sunlit space used to be Reginald Sterling's dark, oppressive private study. In fact, the entire sprawling estate now belonged completely to me. I had gutted the gaudy, pretentious interior of the mansion, tearing out the heavy velvet and cheap gold trim. I transformed the property into the sleek, modern corporate headquarters for my new investment firm, an organization dedicated entirely to funding women and minority-owned startups that men like Reginald used to systematically crush. The Sterling Empire was completely dead and buried, and I was standing proudly on its ashes. I watched the foundation board file out of the room, their voices buzzing with genuine excitement over our upcoming fiscal quarter. Once the heavy glass doors clicked shut, a profound, satisfying silence settled over the room. I walked slowly across the wide expanse of the newly redesigned floor plan, feeling the commanding echo of my heels against the polished concrete. The space that once served as Vivian Sterling's exclusionary, suffocating formal living room was now the vibrant, beating heart of the Vanguard Scholarship Fund. Stacks of applications and financial audits rested neatly on the sleek, modern desks. Where priceless, illicitly acquired European artwork once hung the walls, now featured polished silver plaques. These plaques dedicated full tuition grants and professional mentorships to brilliant young women of color, pursuing advanced degrees in corporate finance and forensic accounting. I was actively funding training and empowering the exact demographic Reginald Sterling had spent his entire pathetic career trying to lock out of the boardroom. I was funding an entire generation of women legally equipped to audit and dismantle corrupt men just like him. I walked over to the custom wet bar built into the far wall and poured myself a single glass of expensive vintage red wine. The deep crimson liquid caught the afternoon sunlight as I swirled it gently, the rich aroma grounding me in the absolute reality of my total victory. I took a slow, measured walk to the center of the room, stopping precisely at the exact spot where the Sterling's massive antique mahogany dining table used to sit. It was the very place where they had spent years systematically attempting to reduce me to a quiet, obedient shadow. It was the place where they had laughed at my expense, mocked my background, and unwittingly cemented their own inevitable destruction. My former in-laws used to tell me that I had no right to sit at their dinner table. They constantly reminded me that I lacked the pedigree, the breeding, and the inherent status to ever occupy a chair in their exclusive manufactured world. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine, letting the complex flavor settle perfectly on my tongue. They were absolutely right. I never had the right to sit at their table, because I was born to buy that specific table, smash it into worthless firewood, and build my own untouchable empire directly on top of their ruins. I lowered the crystal glass, my posture perfectly straight, as I looked directly forward. I let a slow, razor-sharp smile stretch across my face, cold, entirely victorious, and completely unapologetic.